dad has been a missionary in Santa Cruz, Bolivia for almost my entire life, and in 2010, a people group called the Iore were brought to his attention. Specifically, these girls. Their culture has been confined to an area of the city that is rich with poverty, and these girls' hope in fellow man has all but crumbled like the walls of their humble homes. These girls live in a world where women have been selling themselves for sex and have done so for generations. Some of these girls in this picture, as young as 12, have been pimped out by their own mothers, taught to be tools and objects to men in the city. These girls learn to be sexual towards men almost 4 times their age, all for the lust of being able to live their own lives. The walls of their community do not hear these girls' cries of brokenness because they have all but become deaf to them for so many years. But many of us here are like these walls, deaf to the cries of girls like these. Not these girls specifically, but girls much closer than Bolivia. The reality is that less than 15 minutes away from where our class sits, people are being sex trafficked daily. We all may say that's not me bringing that girl in my car though, but the video you and I may click on may not all be that different in the reality of sex trafficking. And when I let my eyes be open to this awful evil and how my actions have contributed to the abuse, exploitation, and suffering of these individuals, it was clear that it was something I had to talk about. So let's talk about it. Sex trafficking is an issue fueled by the demand created by pornography and must be resolved by the decriminalization of sex trafficking victims and an increased awareness of the effects of pornography on the sex trafficking industry. But before we get into all of that, first we need to talk about what is sex trafficking and how big of an issue it is here in the United States. Then we need to talk about the causes, the whys, the whos, and the hows of sex trafficking. And then we can talk about some of the solutions, specifically combating the supply and demand of the sex trafficking industry. So what is sex trafficking, and how big of an issue is it here in the United States? I had an interview with Connie Anderson, a regional justice specialist for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. She noted that most people think of the movie Taken or a sweet little blonde-haired girl in the basement crying for her mommy, but in reality, sex trafficking is simply not that. According to Federal Law 7102, the term sex trafficking means the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. Sex trafficking simply isn't the Hollywood kidnappings or the pimps and prostitutes on the streets we see in our video games. It's a multi-dimensional, multi-webbed issue that many of us have been, are, or could be connected to in some way. According to Polaris, a nonprofit research group focused on human trafficking, in 2019 alone, 8,248 cases of sex trafficking happened in the United States. From that same report, 14,597 victims and survivors were identified by Polaris's hotline, which, when I take a step back and think about, is amazing to hear that 14,000 people are now free from this terrible industry. But it begs the question, how did they get there in the first place? So then we need to go into the causes, the whys, the whos, and the hows. And the why is a simple answer of supply and demand. Fight the New Drug is a porn awareness foundation and they reported on Pornhub, one of the most popular pornographic websites in the world today. In 2019 alone, Pornhub recorded 42 billion visits to their site in that year. This graph here is a breakdown of what happens every minute on their site in 2019. And you might say, how does this affect or relate to sex trafficking? Well, a study done by Dr. Melissa Farley, the founder of Prostitution Research and Education, found that 49% of trafficking victims and survivors she interviewed reported being recorded for pornographic reasons. And 80% of the prostitutes reported being shown porn to illustrate what exactly the buyer wanted them to perform. The demand comes from the porn consumer to have the newest content. As long as the person is naked, it doesn't matter who they are. And when the videos are not enough, that's when the victims are exploited the most. But who are these victims? According to a study done by Dr. Celia Williamson, a research leader in human trafficking, she found that 62.6% of childhood trafficking victims ran away as a minor. And childhood sexual abuse was experienced by 44.6% of the child trafficking victims she surveyed. Shared Hope International is a nonprofit devoted to stopping sex trafficking, and they have characterized most of their victims to be targeted for their low self-esteem, the history of abuse, neglect, homelessness, or being in the foster care system. Quite literally, most of these sex traffickers hunt and prey on the weakest, most vulnerable people, but how do they get them trapped? From my conversation with Connie Anderson, she said that sex traffickers simply just go and show interest in these individuals, and that's all it takes. And then they become groomed and trapped into becoming sexual slaves. According to 2019 report by Polaris, again, the top 5 most forms of force, fraud, and coercion related to sex trafficking are drug intimidation, drugs with weapons, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. So we've discussed the problems. We've discussed the causes of sex trafficking, the whys, the whos, and the hows, but now we need to talk about some of the solutions. And let's focus on the supply and demand of the sex trafficking industry. First, the supply. We need to decriminalize the sex trafficking victims. An example of this done in America today are the catch courts found in Franklin County, Ohio. These are 2-year programs integrated to the approach of treatment, health, and behavioral medication for defendants who have been charged by the Franklin County Municipal Court for prostitution, soliciting, and etc. And if these victims show a history of being in human trafficking, they qualify for this program. An independent study done by Dr. Karen Miner-Romanoff showed that 71% of these people in this specific program felt deterred from re-offending, and another 71% felt they had learned healthier life skills from this program. We can support programs like these to change lives of victims, and I encourage you to educate yourselves about other programs like the catch courts, and contacting your local state representatives for these programs to be implemented into the legislation in our own communities. But second, we also need to talk about the demand and create awareness about the effects of pornography. Dr. Robert Weiss is an expert in the treatment of adult intimacy disorders. He noted that 40 million people call themselves regular porn visitors, and 70% of the men ages 18 to 24 visit porn sites at least once per month. But the point of me saying all these numbers and statistics about porn are not to make people shame or feel shame about watching porn. Rather, we need to think about those millions of people as people unaware of the actions that they have and their effects on other people. So I'm calling you to speak up about this, to promote awareness in your community about the effects of porn consumption on sex trafficking in a productive way, like having talks like these. And I offer up websites like these as pathways to allow people to become aware of the unseen issue of porn in relation to sex trafficking. Lastly, if you're someone who struggles with porn, I want to be the first to say that you're not alone, that you're still loved, and if you want to take steps to change this habit that you have, please reach out to people like me, groups like this. So we've talked about a lot today. But I hope you can remember this, is that sex trafficking is a real issue, that thousands of victims in the United States are being abused every day. And the porn industry has perpetuated the demand for sex trafficking and the victimization of vulnerable people. And we need to stop the spread of convicting victims, and we need to start spreading truth about the effects of pornography on sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is hard to talk about. And I tear up many times knowing that my ignorance has affected so many individuals. So next time you're about to go and click on a video, I ask you to do as I do and think about these girls.